Released in 2015, the Samsung Galaxy S6 was one of the most significant redesigns to the Galaxy line ever to this point, coming with a full new glass and aluminum design to replace the plastic of old, along with that absolutely gorgeous curved Super AMOLED screen on the S6 Edge in particular. This was one of the most beautiful smartphones ever made by any company in 2015, and in my opinion, it's a design that still holds up incredibly well. And yet, despite this, the Galaxy S6 would immediately become one of the most hated and controversial Samsung devices of all time, as important accessibility options and user choice was removed with no more expandable memory, along with no more swappable batteries. It was as if Samsung had made a more Apple-like device, and for better or for worse, it definitely stood out from the crowd of dull aluminum smartphones back in 2015. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91Tech, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Samsung Galaxy S6. How does it hold up a full decade later?
This is the Samsung Galaxy S6 Edge. It comes with built-in wireless charging capabilities. The iPhone 6? Yeah, no, not so much. Check it out. The S6 takes wider selfies that fit everybody. The iPhone 6 just cut off Nano. Nana? When you do the math, it's clear. 6 is greater than 6. The Galaxy S6 Edge. Not all smartphones are created equal.
There is a lot to discuss with the Galaxy S6, from its history to the phone itself and how it manages to perform after so many years. And of course, running only Android 7 Nougat and rocking 2015 hardware, this phone is never going to be a pleasant experience in today's world if you were to try to actually use it as a main driver. It does, however, serve as a really beautiful and historic piece of tech, marking a clear turning point in how Samsung would be designing their smartphones moving forward. For the uninitiated, the Galaxy S6 being a controversial device might seem rather odd. No expandable storage, no swappable batteries, this is by no means out of place in the 2020s, and it's been the norm for the better part of a decade at this point from most smartphone manufacturers. Heck, we've still got the headphone jack here, that's pretty nice to see, and the redesign with this phone is astonishing, coming from the still good-looking but far less premium Galaxy S5. I mean, we went from this cheap-feeling plastic phone with a plastic frame painted to look metallic to a device with some real substance to it. You've got this beautiful glass back panel 2.5 years before Apple themselves would go back to glass with the iPhone 10, and then this solid aluminum frame that immediately makes the device feel so much more luxurious in the hand. One of the most common critiques of Galaxy phones for years had been that their build quality always felt cheap despite the pricing. And while there were plenty of benefits to the plastic, the reality was that Samsung was definitely lacking something compared to Apple in the hardware design department. Where they tended to make up for it were in their Super AMOLED displays, which were larger, far more vibrant, sharp, and just really popped compared to everything else on the market. And the Galaxy S6 would manage to bring this to a whole new level with the all-new Galaxy S6 Edge, a phone that was identical to the regular Galaxy S6, but with this screen that curved over the sides, giving it this, well, edge. While there was little practical application for this, it did make the smartphone more immersive than ever before, and it was something that felt truly new within an industry that was, for the most part, starting to feel very stale for a lot of users. Now, this, of course, wasn't actually a new concept, with Samsung having released their own Galaxy Note Edge about 6 months prior, which had one side of the screen curve over. This was all thanks to the evolution of flexible displays, which was a relatively new technology. And while the Note Edge was more of a concept device than anything else, being an offshoot of the far more popular Note 4, the Galaxy S6 Edge was poised to finally deliver this tech to a mainstream consumer base. This was also a time where smartphones were getting significantly larger, as phablets had been popularized by mainly Samsung themselves. And while the Note series was still very much a thing, months after the S6 release, Samsung would also release the Galaxy S6 Edge Plus in order to capitalize on this still growing trend of bigger and bigger smartphones. Plus, Apple was selling two size options themselves at this point. Samsung probably wanted to be able to do the same, since the S6 and S6 Edge were the same size. So everything we've seen here, so far so good, right? This on paper seems like an absolute home run for Samsung in 2015. This phone brought the Galaxy line up to par with iPhone in terms of build quality, if not surpassing them outright. I mean, the display was far superior, and you had a cool new built-in feature with wireless charging, thanks to the glass back that Apple was still years out from adding, and there was fast charging too. There was a lot to like here, and the Galaxy S5, as great as it was, felt like it was made by a completely different company, despite only being a year older. But that right That was the problem. The Galaxy S6 was a really great smartphone, but it didn't feel at all like a Samsung. At least not a Samsung their users had become accustomed to. In the early 2010s, Samsung had found great success in posturing themselves as sort of the anti-Apple. Apple won't give you big displays? Don't worry bro, we got you. Apple's making you pay way too much for extra storage? Screw that man, just use a microSD card. Your iPhone battery sucks? Don't be a wall hugger. Just swap out your Galaxy S5's battery by easily taking off the back plastic panel.
Are you changing your battery?
Yep.
Is that the new Samsung?
Yep. Have a good one, man.
Don't be a wall hugger.
Sorry.
Get ultra power saving mode and interchangeable battery on the Samsung Galaxy S5.
This ad right here was released in 2014, and yet April 2015, we have a phone from the exact same company that could now be made fun of in the exact same fashion. Samsung removing user choice from the Galaxy S6 was not just a controversial or greedy move, but it was seen as a spit in the face of many of their users, and it made the Galaxy S5 not only the end of an era, but to many a far more ideal experience than the S6, even in 2015. The S6 felt like Samsung's own take on making an iPhone more than anything else. Now mind you, plenty of reactions were still quite positive. Tech reviewers generally praised the phone, and justifiably so, I mean, just look at it. But when you're going to make a device so radically different from a previous model, not just in design but also function, you're going to ruffle some feathers, and oh boy were those feathers ever ruffled. And trust me, we're only at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what Samsung removed with the S6 here. It wasn't just the swappable battery and microSD card slot, those were just the biggest highlights. One big annoyance was the lack of water resistance, a feature only just added with the Galaxy S5. This one I will never understand why they removed, and being an idiot, many years ago now, I actually killed my Galaxy S6 after assuming that it was water resistant, because, you know, the previous model was. Yeah, this is the only time I've ever killed a smartphone out of sheer stupidity, by the way, to my recollection at least. So I'm happy to give you all a reason to make fun of me down in the comments. Yes, I really did drown this Galaxy S6. It does not work at all anymore. You also had a reduced battery capacity in the S6, which felt like an even further smack in the face, given you couldn't even just swap out the battery with a different one. Fast charging, sure, it's nice, but you still have to plug the phone in, and that's not always feasible. You don't want to be a wall hugger, right? It might not sound like a big deal anymore because, well, we're so used to not having any user choice, but this was like the biggest selling point of Samsung's back in the day for a lot of people. I remember my friend's mom gushing over the fact that she could bring a spare battery in her purse and swap out her S5's battery at any time. So for Samsung to just remove that feature out of nowhere for people, like, kind of a big deal, and a lot of people were really unhappy. There were a good few software features missing, which wasn't always the worst thing. That infamous TouchWiz interface had become absurdly bloated with feature creep on the Galaxy S4 and S5. As much as I loved taking 5 hours to scroll through my entire settings app, but still, it was basically Samsung's entire strategy to this point to just throw anything and everything at their users, give them all the choice in the world, even if it amounted to too much choice and could be overwhelming. The S6 and its software and hardware aimed to simplify. This was perhaps better for a mainstream audience, the sort of consumer who previously may have used iPhones, but this was never going to be anywhere near as appealing for the die-hard Samsung user who'd been for years jeering at Apple sheep and their pathetic non-swappable batteries, rubbish 16 gigabytes of storage with no room for expansion, or most critically, their complete lack of humidity and temperature sensors. Yes, the Galaxy S4 really did have humidity and temperature sensors for some reason. And of course, the reality was that as cool as the Galaxy S6 Edge looked, and I mean it did look pretty dang cool, it just didn't really bring any reason to pay more for it over the regular Galaxy S6. This wasn't something Samsung was typically known for doing, throwing in a purely cosmetic difference and then charging more for it. Even something like the Note series was not only larger, but included a stylus, and thus had a reason to be separate from the typical Galaxy S. With the S6 Edge, you were paying for a phone that you could show off, sure, but isn't that the sort of same thing iPhone users were constantly accused of doing, just paying more for that Apple logo on the back? Now it is worth noting that the Galaxy S5, while it was heavily praised by Samsung's user base and often considered far superior to the S6 back in the day, actually didn't sell that well compared to the Galaxy S4. Data on total sales for the S5 is hard to find, but at least by the 3-month mark Samsung had sold about 12 million units versus 16 million S4s sold in the same period. Samsung was reporting dropping profits and apparently sold about 40% fewer S5s than expected. The S5 was still very much a success, just not nearly as successful as the S4, and nowhere near what Samsung Samsung was hoping for. With this in mind, it makes sense Samsung felt they needed to shake things up in order to regain ground. The S3, S4, and S5 had all looked very similar to each other, with mostly only small refinements in the design. It was about time for a major dramatic change, one that could not only tempt current Galaxy users to upgrade to the latest generation, but also sway current iPhone users away from Apple. A monumental task, with Apple's first phablets in the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus coming out in late 2014, finally removing Samsung's biggest advantage and selling point from the past few years, the larger sizes. The problem with the S6 is Samsung tried to do too much all at once, while removing too many things that made their phones special to begin with. The S6 didn't feel like a Samsung device, but it was still absolutely a breathtaking smartphone and a really solid experience despite the downsides compared to those earlier models. So with the context and history out of the way, let's take a step back here and look a little closer at the hardware that I'm holding here in my hand. The Samsung Galaxy S6 Edge just glows in its premium golden glory, feeling light and fantastic in the hand, bringing this air of luxury certainly missing from the Galaxy S5. That phone still looked nice to be sure, but there's just no comparison between the glass back and aluminum frame of the S6 and the plastic of old. We've got a good few color options with white pearl, black sapphire, and gold platinum, and you've also got a more vibrant blue topaz and emerald green as well. Apparently there was also this limited edition Iron Man Galaxy S6, and if you want one for yourself, it'll only run you between 6 and 13 grand on eBay, which seems perfectly reasonable to me. The S6, even without the plastic, manages to be extremely light and very thin, and while the materials are different from previous Galaxies, we still have a very much familiar overall design layout. You've got the centered camera on the glass back with a noticeable camera bump, though it feels pretty minimal nowadays, and the Samsung logo underneath. I will say that glass picks up far too many fingerprints, and that is one downside, but aside from that, I really like it. We've got the SIM tray on the top of the phone, and the headphone jack along with the micro USB port on the bottom. USB-C would have been really nice here, given it was starting to get very popular in Androids around 2015, but it would be another couple years before Samsung would bring it with the S8. While this phone from the back and sides is pretty enough, it's from the front where it really stands out from the crowd with this gorgeous immersive curved display on the edge specifically. For comparison's sake, I have a regular S7 here, which looks identical to the regular S6, and both the S6 and S6 Edge had a 5.1-inch Super AMOLED panel running a 1440p resolution, making for a vivid, vibrant, and sharp image that completely blew away the vast majority of competition in 2015. It still holds up fantastically. The S6 Edge Plus was 5.7 inches, so significantly larger, and would also contain an extra gigabyte of RAM. No infrared transmitter though, which is on the normal S6 and S6 Edge. These curved edges really aren't that useful in terms of actual function, even with some gimmicks like this edge screen feature, which allows you to bring over this panel for apps and the like. Sorta pointless, sure, but the Edge does look really cool, and I didn't find myself experiencing too many accidental touches, though it could very much happen depending on how you're gripping the phone. The way the light hits the screen can also make for some poor visibility with reflections on the side, bit of a glare, that's not great, and ultimately there was really no reason to buy the Edge in particular over the regular S6, aside from the fact that again it just looked really cool. But hey, at least it does truly look really cool. This phone feels far more modern than the S5, even though it's in reality only a single year newer. I think it's just the build and the higher quality materials that really pushes that, plus that curved screen doesn't hurt. The software in Android 7 Nougat feels kind of antiquated today, but we still have a familiar feeling TouchWiz UI interface. It's functional, but not exactly fast, and it feels less bloated in terms of overwhelming the users with features compared to the S5, but still kind of bloated. Now, I was never a fan of TouchWiz to begin with, but it works, and compared to earlier iterations of the software, it doesn't feel as antiquated or old. I recently reviewed the Galaxy S3, for example, and this phone feels light years ahead. 3 years between smartphones might not make much of a difference anymore, but in the early to mid 2010s, you could really see the jump between models. That fingerprint reader in the home button is unfortunately pretty rough, and while it thankfully doesn't require you to swipe your finger across it like the S5 did, it is still incredibly inconvenient and inconsistent. You can see me set it up, and immediately after, it still took me 3 tries to actually unlock the device, and almost like a full minute before I finally was able to get it on my first attempt. It's really bad, and I think the reason is obvious. The home button is just too small. It's this little rectangle versus the normal sort of Touch ID home button sort of look that you would see on the iPhone, as well as some other phones I reviewed recently like the Nexus 6P and Nexus 5X. Those fingerprint sensors are far more reliable, and it's the issue with Samsung's design here. Now that being said, what I do really like is that at least we do have a physical home button here, right on that bottom bezel, along with the navigation buttons that disappear appear when they're not being used. Much better than the old classic Android thing of having a digital navigation bar on the bottom of the screen above this huge, thick bottom bezel that's just wasting space. I'm looking at you, Google Pixel. Still, the fingerprint sensor, pretty rough here. It's better than the S5, but that's not really saying much. As a whole, the design just really carries the Galaxy S6 as a phone, in my opinion, and particularly with that edge. It's gorgeous, plain and simple, and controversy aside, I think it's easily one of the most beautiful smartphones Samsung has ever made. For the internal hardware, we're rocking the Exynos 7420 octa processor and 3GB of RAM. This was the first 64-bit chip in a Samsung flagship, and there was no Snapdragon version of the S6 this time around, which makes it a bit easier to review, at least compared to like the 5,000 different models of most of Samsung's phones, I feel like, from back in the day. For storage, you were looking at 32, 64, or 128GB, with, as we know well, no option for expansion, but at least even the base storage of 32 gigs was sizable enough for 2015. Heck, Apple would later that year launch the iPhone 6s still at a ridiculous 16 gigs. Way too little storage, especially considering how many updates that phone got. I was a bit disappointed with the S6's performance, as swiping around the interface gave me plenty of lag, even when nothing was really going on in the background. It works, but it's not exactly pleasant, and I suppose that shouldn't be too surprising given the fact that this phone is a decade old now. If you're going to attempt to use modern apps or browse the web, you're gonna run into hiccups everywhere, and there's really no reason to use this phone anymore outside the pure novelty of it. You could also look to something like a custom ROM, though the community behind the S6 is nowhere near as expansive as the S5's ever was, but they're still out there, and downgrading the software also seems like a decent option, which would likely help with performance. This phone originally came with Android 5. The battery performance here was never considered great, with the battery itself being smaller than the one in the S5, but it would have gotten you a day's use no problem in most circumstances 10 years ago. Naturally, smartphone batteries do degrade over time, and because of this, the S6 has in a certain sense aged quite poorly compared to the S5. In that phone, it is really easy to just plop in a new battery anytime, whereas here, it's a huge pain to get into the device at all, with it being sealed by adhesive. Most people would have to get it professionally done, which obviously isn't worth it anymore, but still, it makes the S5 at least hold up better in that department. At least we do have wireless charging, which is nice, and of course, there's fast charging too. Let's take a look at the cameras, which are about exactly what you would expect from a 2015 Android flagship. We've got the 5-megapixel front-facing camera, and it takes actually pretty decent selfies for the era. It's a pretty wide-angle lens, which is really nice, and we actually saw that marketed in that commercial earlier, and they've got that annoying beauty mode on by default, but oh well. Definitely an improvement over the S5 selfie camera, which was only 2 megapixels. On the rear, we have the main 16-megapixel camera sensor. More megapixels doesn't always mean better quality, and I don't think this phone really stood out as any sort of industry leader back in 2015, but it was still absolutely one of the best options on the market. Photos in the right conditions can look really good, ideally outdoors in sunlight. It's in more poor lighting that you're going to notice the same issues that always crop up with older smartphones, as these small sensors can only take in so much light. Then you get noise and grain and it's blurry and etc. But with some care and by taking a few photos at a time to ensure one turns out, I was able to get some pictures I was pretty happy with. It's not bad at all when you consider this phone is 10 years old now. For video, we can film in 4K at 30 frames per second, not bad for 2015, and the quality's not great, but it is at least a high resolution. This phone does have optical image stabilization, and while it's definitely nowhere near what we have now in terms of, actually stabilizing the image, it is better than nothing. All in all, the cameras are, again, exactly what you would expect from a 2015 Samsung flagship smartphone. Good for the time, not so great anymore. It held up just fine with the competition of the era, and with some effort, you can definitely get some nice shots still, but most importantly, the phone is capable of capturing moments and memories, and whether you were snapping photos 10 years ago or today, that's all that really matters in the end, even if the image isn't as sharp or the HDR as consistent as a modern flagship can do today. There's a lot to consider when talking about the Galaxy S6, the S6 Edge, and the S6 Edge Plus. Heck, I haven't even mentioned the S6 Active, which brought waterproofing along with a far more rugged design and capabilities. The phone was about the same price as the S6, had a bigger battery, and was arguably better in a few ways, but it was also plastic, had no fingerprint sensor, and I mean, it definitely looks less premium. But still, I do really like how Samsung would even have an option like this to begin with. The S6 represents such a shift in how Samsung would operate moving forward. This was a company that no longer seemed to aim to be the anti-Apple, but instead one that aspired to make the best possible competitor. Phones you could consider just as luxurious and beautifully designed as an iPhone, except they just so happened to run Android, and included features that Apple was still years away from adding. The Android market in general was changing quickly around 2015, with the plastic phones of old falling out of style very quickly, at least when it came to the more expensive flagship options. And while it can be certainly openly debated whether or not this was for the better, there's no question Samsung was quickly changing, and the brand, the company that made the Galaxy S5, was seemingly long gone. What I love about this phone is how Samsung was so willing to experiment and do something different. What I hate is how they left their consumer base in the dust and made their own ad spot from the previous year feel like a sick joke. But the Galaxy S6 was boundary pushing, and an interesting case of Samsung jumping ahead of the rest of the smartphone pack when it came to the future of how the industry would move. Historically, Apple and their iPhones tend to set the standard for hardware design, and whatever they do, everyone else inevitably follows. Apple might make an aluminum phone, and within a few years, almost every Android flagship looks about the same. But not Samsung. They went with glass and aluminum for the sake of wireless charging, and 2 years later, Apple would end up also moving to glass to add wireless charging themselves. Samsung had morphed the future of smartphones by pushing phablet devices into the mainstream, and the glass Galaxy S6 would also set a precedent for how smartphones would look in the future. The Edge display was one of the earliest examples of manufacturers pushing the limits of smartphone bezels, making these screens more immersive than ever before, and with eventual phones like the Galaxy S8 and the iPhone X, those bezels would only continue to shrink. The S6 Edge sort of felt like a phone from the future, right down to the lack of accessibility in expandable storage or swappable batteries, but the problem is that it was made in 2015 and it changed too much too fast. Removing options like the SD card slot was way too greedy and far too dramatic a shift from the S5. And things like water resistance going away as well, it made it feel like Samsung was sort of stepping backwards. Also, I'm particularly salty about that feature's exclusion for definitely no particular reason. I do think Samsung could have made this work, but they just made too many reductions. I think if you had solely removed the swappable battery, which was no doubt necessary for this sort of glass design, that would have been fine. And the evidence of this came in the next year's Galaxy S7. It took the design of the S6, brought back some key features like the SD card slot and water resistance, and bam, you had almost what was the perfect blend between the S5 and the S6. It felt like the best of both worlds. And sure enough, the S7 is still often considered by Samsung fans one of the greatest Galaxies ever made to this day. And for good reason. It was a really fantastic, solid smartphone, but I think we'll save that for a future video. And so with that, I think I'm right about done here. Did any of you have the Galaxy S6 back in the day? Do you think this phone deserves its infamous reputation? Make sure you leave a comment down below. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. We do have a Discord server. You want to come by, say hi, great community over there. And huge shout out to the channel members. Thank you all so much for your support. You guys are the absolute best. And thank you all for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.